Matthew 9, verse 14 to 17. In this passage, the narrative records a question brought to Jesus concerning the practice of fasting. The disciples of John approach him and ask, "Why do we and the Pharisees fast often, but your disciples do not fast?" Their question arises from the religious expectations of the time. Among the Pharisees and among many devoted followers of John the Baptist, fasting had become a visible expression of devotion and repentance. It was associated with mourning, preparation, and anticipation of the coming kingdom. Jesus answers them first with an image from a wedding. Can the children of the bride chamber mourn as long as the bridegroom is with them? In the culture of first century Judea, a wedding feast was a time of joy and celebration. Mourning and fasting were incompatible with the presence of the bridegroom. As long as the bridegroom was present, the attendants rejoiced in the celebration. In this statement, Jesus identifies himself as the bridegroom. The imagery is deeply rooted in the scriptures, where God's covenant relationship with Israel is often described in marital terms. The arrival of the bridegroom signifies the arrival of the long anticipated moment in redemptive history. The kingdom of heaven, which had been promised through the prophets and proclaimed by John, had now drawn near in the presence of the Messiah himself. Yet Jesus adds that, "The days will come when the bridegroom shall be taken from them, and then shall they fast." The phrase, "taken from them," anticipates his rejection and death. His departure would mark a period of sorrow for his followers. The removal of a bridegroom would interrupt the joy of a wedding celebration. After answering the question about fasting, Jesus gives two short illustrations: the patch of new cloth on an old garment and the new wine placed into old wineskins. First, he says that no one sews a piece of unshrunk cloth onto an old garment. If this were done, the new cloth would shrink and tear away from the old fabric, making the tear worse. The point is not merely about clothing, but about incompatibility. Something new cannot simply be attached to something worn and aged without creating a greater rupture. He then gives the second illustration. Neither do men put new wine into old wineskins. Wineskins in the ancient world were made from animal hides. Fresh wine continued to ferment, expanding and producing pressure. New wineskins were flexible and could stretch with the fermentation process. Old wineskins, however, had already been stretched and had become brittle. If new wine were placed into them, they would burst, spilling the wine and destroying the skins. These two illustrations explain the deeper meaning behind his response to the question about fasting. The ministry of Jesus marked the arrival of something fundamentally new in the unfolding of God's covenant purposes. The expectations, structures, and religious expressions that had developed within the older order could not simply contain what was now appearing. The practices surrounding fasting among the Pharisees had become intertwined with the system of religious observances that characterized the age then passing away. Their framework was built upon traditions that emphasized outward demonstrations of devotion, often tied to the rhythms of mourning and longing for redemption yet to come. But the presence of Jesus signaled that the anticipated redemption was no longer merely awaited, it had arrived. The bridegroom stood among them. The kingdom promised by the prophets was breaking into history through his ministry, his teaching, and the authority he demonstrated over sin, sickness, and spiritual powers. For this reason, his disciples were not characterized by the same posture of mourning that marked many religious practices of the time. The appropriate response to the presence of the bridegroom was joy. The illustrations of the garment and the wineskins further reveal that the reality Jesus was bringing could not simply be fitted into the old covenant framework. The old garment and the old wineskins represent an order that had already been stretched by centuries of covenant history and prophetic expectation. Attempting to merge the new with the old in a superficial way would only create a greater rupture. Instead, the new wine required new wineskins. The life and message brought by Jesus introduced a new covenant reality, one centered not on the repetition of ritual observances, but on the fulfillment of what those observances had anticipated. The forms that had served their purpose in pointing forward to redemption were not capable of containing the fullness of the reality that had now appeared. Thus, in these brief sayings, Jesus explains why his disciples did not participate in the fasting practices that characterized many religious groups of that time. The moment in redemptive history had changed. The bridegroom had come, and the presence of the bridegroom signaled the arrival of a new order that could not be confined within the structures of the old. Matthew places this teaching within a section of the gospel that emphasizes the authority of Jesus and the transformation his ministry brings. The question about fasting becomes an opportunity for Jesus to reveal the nature of the transition taking place, a transition from anticipation to fulfillment, from the shadows that pointed forward to the reality now standing among them.